Hello. So today's video is going to be me going through phobias, more specifically the explanations for phobias and why we get them. Um, we are going to be looking at phobias, depression, and OCD. And in order to know the explanations and the treatments for those, we need to actually know what those disorders are. Now, I know we think we all know phobias, we all know depression, we all know OCD. But actually, what I'm going to be showing you is what the DSM-5, which is a big, thick book on every mental health disorder ever categorized. Well, not ever categorized, but all the current mental health disorders. What is in front of you now is what the DSM says about specific phobias. Now, specific phobia is something that you are, like an object that you are specifically frightened of. It's, something it's usually an object, etc., or like an animal or something. So I'm going to be going through the diagnostic criteria for phobias, and then I'm going to go into the explanations for phobias as well, right? So there's quite a few things here. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. This is what you need to show in order to be officially diagnosed with a disorder. So disorders are quite common. I'm going to go through the prevalence of them quite soon. But if we have a look at what they actually are, if we look at A to begin with, it has a marked fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation, right? So that's pretty much what we think of as phobias. It almost always provokes immediate fear or anxiety, almost always. So, it's a reliable reaction. It's a consistent reaction. The phobic object or situation is actively avoided or endured with intense fear or anxiety. So you run away at the first sign, or you kind of grit your teeth. And often, and mostly actually, the fear is out of proportion to the actual danger posed by the specific object. So the reaction does not match how scared you probably should be, for example. So off the top of my head, spiders can kill you, of course they can, but not really in this country, and not often in dangerous countries like Australia. Does it really require you to literally jump out of your chair and run in the opposite direction? It's not someone running at you with a shotgun or a knife. It's a spider, which probably isn't going to bite you. So that reaction is out of context and out of proportion to what you should be reacting to. It is very, very persistent. It's very persistent, and look at this. For you to have been diagnosed, you need to have been suffering with this disorder, this phobic reaction, for at least 6 months. What happens if you haven't been? Well, then technically you don't have a phobia yet. It has to be persistent. What else? It causes clinically significant distress, and this is quite important as well. It impairs social, occupational, or other areas of your life, such as relationships. It has to actually affect your life. You have to make choices. So, for example, if you are an emetophobe, off the top of my head, if you are an emetophobe, you have phobia of vomit, and you choose, say, not to go to university because you're understandably a bit worried that going out for nights out, you're gonna be exposed to this. That would be it debilitating your life. And the disturbance is not explained by other mental health disorders, such as generalized anxiety or panic disorder, agoraphobia, so on and so forth. So that is what you need. That is what you need in order to be diagnosed. But I just want to go through the DSM in a bit more detail because there's so much here. And I'm going to tell you not to read this book, but also read this book. It's so interesting. It really is. I mean, you've got a lot of diagnostic features here, which I'm not going to go through now, but these are just little teeny tiny things that kind of build upon those criteria we've looked at. You've got the prevalence rate just here, and this I find quite interesting. So the DSM, which is made in the US, so all the stats will be based in the US, but approximately 7 to 9% of the population will get a phobia every single year. 7 to 9% of the population will get a phobia. Now, I think that's quite low personally. I think phobias is more like a 30% kind of thing. I think certainly phobias are more common than than depression, surely, but according to the stats, they're not. Depression's actually a lot more common. Prevalence rates in European countries are largely similar, about 6%, so less, which then raises the question, does culture have an influence over our mental health? In this case, clearly, because in Asian, African, and Latin American countries, only 2 to 4% get phobias. Right? We in the Western world apparently get phobias a lot more. Why is that? What is it about our culture that makes us more phobic or makes us more vulnerable to phobia? Prevalence rates are low in older people, so they do tend to be something you get younger. And females are more frequently affected than males at a rate of approximately double. So it's the same thing as depression, for example. Females are twice as likely going to get it. Now, phobias are generally something you can't hide, right? Phobias are something like depression, right, which you can hide. Phobias are something you cannot really hide. So that rate of double for females is probably quite accurate. Because in depression you can hide that. So some males who may not like that they have depression, they can hide it and pretend to be upbeat and happy and etc. etc. But actually, phobias you wouldn't be able to hide. So you'd assume that's quite valid. And you've got a few other bits here as well. So and this is what we are going to go through today. Specific phobia sometimes develops following a traumatic event or observation of others going through the event. And that is what we are going to be looking at today. I'm sure it does say down here, that it is potentially biological as well. But it doesn't. There is a suicide risk there as well, which I'm not going to go into. So look, there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot here, and to be honest, I could read that a lot more. You do have the risk factors down here. So, what are the factors that put someone at risk for developing a phobia? So, for example, if we look at temperamental, if you're a neurotic individual, then you're more likely going to be at risk of a phobia. Environmental, things like parental overprotectiveness. That makes sense, doesn't it? If your parents shelter you from the real world, and then you go off into the real world and something bad happens to you, you're going to be much more affected than that. Whereas a parent who raises you on the street, for example, and regularly, walks down alleys with you for a laugh to see if you get mugged, you aren't going to develop a phobia that much because you've been exposed to the world. There are also genetic issues here as well. So to be honest, I could go into this a lot. There's a lot more here. You've got comorbidities as well. So comorbidities are essentially a term you need to know in the second year. But comorbidities are essentially what disorders come up alongside phobias quite a lot. So you've got other anxiety disorders. Depression comes up alongside phobias quite a lot. Substance abuse comes up quite a lot. Personality disorders come up, particularly dependent personality disorder. So these are comorbid. It's like if you have a car crash, you're likely going to have broken bones and lacerations, for example. Those things are comorbid. If you have anxiety, there's a good chance you're going to have depression as well. If you have phobias in this case, there's a good chance you're going to have depression or anxiety. These things come up quite a lot together. The question I always ask my students is, do you really think you only ever suffer one mental health disorder if you're mentally unwell? Not really. It's usually a spider's web of different disorders. So that is phobias. I'm going to go into why this happens. Now, the one thing you want to take away from this today is that we're going to be looking at this. We're going to be looking at explanations of phobias from a behavioral point of view. Is there biological explanations? Yes. Are there cognitive explanations? Of course there are. But what we are going to be looking at specifically is the behavioral approach to explaining phobias. This video doesn't exist because I've deleted it. But we are going to be looking at behavioral approach. Now, in order to do this, my advice to you, and I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, my advice would be to recap the behaviourist approach, including social learning theory. You do need to know operant and classical conditioning for this. This is not the video where I'm going to go through that. There is a video for that already. So my recommendation would be for you to make sure that you know the behaviourist approach quite well. Phobias, you can learn your phobias, and that is pretty much what the behaviourist approach says. You learn your phobias. So let's go through this in a bit of detail then. So as I say, while there are a variety of ways in which phobias may be explained, sort of evolutionary, biological, for example, we're going to look at how we learn from our experiences to develop a phobia through operant and classical conditioning. So a brief recap of those. Operant conditioning is learning behavior through consequence. So if you get punished for something, you're going to not do it. That behavior will be extinguished. If you are rewarded for a behavior, or if that behavior is positively reinforced, you are more likely going to do that behavior. Now, your whole life, your entire bloody life, from parenting to schooling, you have been conditioned to within an inch of your life through reward and punishment. And even at college, it happens now as well. Classical conditioning, on the other hand, is learning through association. So you learn to associate two things together. So the model we're going to be looking at is what's called the two-process model. It is two processes because classical conditioning happens and then operant conditioning happens. And those are the two processes that you go through when developing a phobia. So the first stage is you actually getting a phobia. So I just want to go through an example just to contextualize this. I don't want you to have Vietnam-style flashbacks necessarily, but I do want you to think about a potentially traumatic event that happened to you. Not anything that's too traumatizing, though that is literally what I did ask for. But one thing that happened to me that I tell my students is when I was flying in a plane, obviously, I was flying from Fiji to Los Angeles. And the plane took off from Fiji airport, and as we were taking off, I was with my friend Penny, as we were taking off, the ceiling above us just exploded, basically, right? There was a big bang, carbon fiber everywhere, water was coming down from the pipes, clearly a pipe had burst, and you felt the plane lose power, like the lights dimmed, the plane was like that, basically, and you felt it kind of like, oh. Now, that's a traumatic experience, okay? That's a traumatic experience that I have gone through and I've seen other people going through. That is how you acquire phobias, through a traumatic event. Maybe it was you watching a really, really scary film as a teenager. Maybe you got mugged, for example, and you got scared of going outside. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder. So other people might not have seen that ceiling exploding above them on a plane that's taken off from an impoverished country scary. I did. But trauma is in the eye of the beholder, basically. So it's subjective. Apparently, and I don't actually remember this, but apparently when that happened, I was very calm, according to Penny, my friend, and I turned to her and I just said, "Penny, we're going to die." And I just calmly turned to look out the window again. I have no memory of this, so clearly I've repressed it. I don't want to dig it up just in case it was actually quite traumatizing. Stage one is how you acquire the phobia. You have a traumatic event through, and write this down, classical conditioning, you very, very quickly associate the trauma of the event with the object that you are now going to be afraid of. So this is where you do actually need to know behaviorism. So little Albert is the classic example that you need to know for this piece of research. He was literally taught to be scared of a white rat. Now, at the beginning, and please make a note of this as well, because I need you to understand neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, so on and so forth, right? So this is little Albert. He's dead now. He died quite soon after this, actually. He died when he was 5 years old. It's actually thought because of the traumatic experience he went through. But this is little Albert, right? When you show him a rat before the pairing, he has no response. He's not scared of it. right? But what happens? And so, fine, we'll park that. Separate to that, if you were to bang a loud or make a loud noise, so get a hammer and bang it on a steel bar right behind his head, that would create a fear response. All right. So those two are separate incidences. You show him a white rat, nothing happens. You bang a thing, that happens. But what happens if you do the two at the same time? What happens if you show him the white rat, which he's not afraid of, but at the same time you bang the steel bar behind his head? What you're doing there is you are pairing the unconditioned stimulus with which does create fear. You're pairing the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus. You're pairing them together. And if you do that enough times, and sometimes once can be enough, you don't have to have the traumatic experience several times. If you do that enough, what will happen is you will start to associate the white rat with the loud noise, and eventually you become afraid of the white rat. So one thing to note down again as well, because this is the most important thing. After pairing, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. Now, what is meant by that? You have conditioned a stimulus to have a conditioned response. So every time you now see the white rat, because of your associations with the loud noise, every time you see the white rat, you will always have a conditioned response of a fear response. You would always have the conditioned response of fear. Now, one thing I need you to make a note of again, and I keep saying that phraseology, it really annoys me, but one thing I do need you to write down, changed it, is that the conditioned stimulus almost always provokes a conditioned response without thought, without processing, without thinking about it. It just boom, boom, all the time. There's no thinking involved according to this. And it's what we call the stimulus response dynamic. That is basically the behavioral approach to getting a phobia. Now, this is, we looked at the two process model, right? This is what we're looking at, the two process model. This is the first process. This is how you acquire the phobia. This is how you get the phobia. It is not how you maintain the phobia. So as I've just said, the stimuli that you become phobic to starts as the neutral stimulus because it doesn't scare you initially, but then you pair it with the unconditioned stimulus. Now, you may have to watch that explanation of me going through this a couple of times. I'm not being funny. I think I explained that quite well there. You're welcome. Jesus, I don't know why I bother. But let's go into stage two, because what we've looked at so far is just why you get the phobia. This is why you maintain it. And you maintain it through operant conditioning. So you get it through classical conditioning, you maintain it through operant conditioning. And the way you do this is through reward and punishment. Mainly you do this through avoiding the phobia and then rewarding yourself for avoiding it. So, for example, I used to be afraid of 7-year-old blonde children. Used to scare the bejesus out of me. I hated them. They made me feel very uncomfortable. Didn't like them, and it was around about 7 years old because I've got a few stories. I got a few stories to tell, a few survival stories to tell. Actually, my group's about a time that kids kind of jumped out on me and I kind of kicked them and stuff. Anyway, but I would avoid all situations. In which I may be presented with a 7-year-old child. So ex-girlfriends, for example, if they would be like, "Oh, do you want to come to this person's birthday party?" And I'd be like, "No, I don't," because there's going to be children there. And I would reward myself by kind of thinking I avoided that. I didn't see it, and therefore, I've avoided the punishment. I've avoided the fear. The basic principle here, and this is quite important, you need to know about the law of effect. The law of effect can clearly be seen in this incident here because sufferers are rewarded for their avoidance. Anything you are rewarded for you are likely going to repeat. That's a critical law of behavior. Any behavior that you are rewarded for, you are much more likely going to repeat. And if you are exposed to it, that's seen as a punishment, because fear, nobody likes fear, for example. And therefore, we're not going to do that behavior. We're not going to expose ourselves to that behavior. So you can see here how the law of effect keeps you locked in that phobia. In order to get out of the phobia, you need to punish yourself by exposing yourself to the phobia. And nobody likes to do that. So it's almost like a binding factor. We have looked at one-trial learning before. I do want to go through this again just briefly, but one-trial learning is basically this concept that behavior can be learned in one incident, one trial of behavior. If the event is so traumatizing, like a plane ceiling exploding, for example, and you think you're going to die, you only need one exposure to that in order to acquire the phobia. Some people don't have one trial learning, as in, not all phobias are learnt from one experience. Some people, bullying, for example, bullying is a good example of this. Bullying is not something that is going to. What do we get afraid of when we're bullied? We get afraid of school, hence the reason we don't want to go to school, because we've associated the school with the bully, because every time the bully bullies you, they are at school, right? So you associate bullying with the school. I think that takes a lot more repeated exposure. You're not going to fear school after one bullying incident unless it was a particularly traumatizing bullying experience. But if someone calls you a name, for example, you're not all of a sudden be like, I can't go to school, I can't go to school. It's going to take much more repeated. So one trial learning does tend to exist when the experience is particularly traumatic. But again, something you probably do need to be able to apply here, definitely. Pieces of research. Watson and Rayner's Little Albert. There is a link just here. I'm not going to go through that because I have gone through it a little briefly, but you probably do need to know in a bit more detail. But there is a link here for Little Albert's case study. That is all the research evidence that you need. But that's pretty much the AO1. Oh, no, that's not quite the AO1. Sorry. Something else happens, actually, in terms of the AO1, which I clearly forgot about. Stimulus generalization. Little Albert was not just afraid of white rats, despite the fact that's all he was ever paired with, the loud sound. Little Albert became afraid of anything that was white and fluffy. So sheep, clouds, apparently. I think it was Santa's beard as well he was quite afraid of, and quite a woolly beard. And this is what we call stimulus generalization. It's when you generalize your phobia out to other similar stimuli. So I'm not afraid of flying after that plane exploding thing, right? But I'm a bit wary, right? But let's just pretend that I was phobic of flying. What else would I be frightened of? I would be frightened of. I'd be frightened of airports. I'd be frightened of. What else would I be frightened of? Maybe heights, I guess, because obviously that's the whole thing about flying. If you're frightened, a lot of people actually, you know what I think is getting quite popular. A lot of people are getting afraid of open water because they don't like what's beneath. They don't like the fact that they can't see what's beneath them, which makes total sense to me, by the way. It's like being afraid of the dark, but almost add drowning in there as well. People who are afraid of open water often stimulus generalize out to other bodies of water. So lakes, rivers, waterfalls, they get ponds, swimming pools, for example. They get afraid, so they generalize out, like open water is in the sea, out to other bodies of water. So stimulus generalization does tend to happen. Now you do need to know a lot of evaluations, but thankfully, oh, by the way, there's a snake on the screen in case you're afraid of snakes. Third most common phobia in the UK. Why, by the way? Why? We have adders. They're pathetic. Although, don't approach them. So, Thorpe and Salkowski's said that this is bullshit. said that there clearly is cognition in between you seeing this stimulus and developing a phobia for it. Look at me now. Hero's a strong word, but I didn't develop a phobia after my actually traumatic experience of flying from Fiji. I didn't develop a phobia and I think it's because I thought about it and I processed and I rationalized it, and I was like, well, this is a freak incident. I was on an airline that I didn't trust to begin with, so I'm probably not going to go with them again. Thus, it's probably not going to happen again, so therefore I don't need to be afraid of it. The point I'm trying to get across here is that there was cognition in between me experiencing this and then not developing a phobia. So it does play a major role. Many people have never had a traumatic experience with snakes and spiders, yet they are scared of them. And actually, the evolutionary approach to phobias explains these a lot better. And this theory is environmentally reductionist. What I mean by that is you're taking quite a complex behavior and you're reducing it down to one single factor, in this case, seeing something scary. Phobias are way too complex to be caused by one single thing. There must be other factors here, and this theory is too reductionist, is too narrow-minded, basically. However, behaviorist treatments do tend to be quite effective, right? So behaviorist treatments, which we're going to look at in the next video, systematic desensitization and flooding, they're incredibly effective. And I could get your phobias and I could treat you within an afternoon. A very, very uncomfortable afternoon it would be for you, but I reckon I could easily do that. So behavioral therapies are actually quite effective. Does that give evidence for the behavioral explanations? Possibly. There is a model answer here, but I've just realised I've got a year 10 taste today and they're all waiting outside, so I should probably go and see them. That is it for the behavioural treatments of phobias. Quite a longer video than I actually intended, but if you have any questions, then answer them or whatever. Right, thanks.